Kellen's arrow whistled through the morning air, striking the wounded elk that had been limping across the grassland for 3 days. The beast collapsed with a final breath, and he felt the familiar emptiness that came after every kill. Not satisfaction, but a hollow echo in his chest where something vital had died long ago. He approached the fallen animal, his weathered hands already reaching for his skinning knife when movement caught his eye. A woman emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, her dark hair braided with wildflowers, her dress the color of autumn wheat. She wasn't running from him or his weapon, she was walking directly toward the elk with the confidence of someone who belonged to this land. "That arrow saved her from days of suffering," she said, kneeling beside the elk's head and placing a gentle hand on its still warm flank. "I've been watching her struggle since the wolves got to her leg." Kellen lowered his bow, studying this stranger who spoke of death with such tenderness. "You've been following a dying elk for 3 days?" "Following, caring for, singing to, yes." She looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds. "I'm Rhiannon. I live in the valley beyond those hills. This elk has been drinking from my stream, and I couldn't bear to let her die alone." Something twisted in Kellen's chest, a sensation he'd forgotten existed. For 15 years, he'd wandered these plains with only his horse and his ghosts for company. He killed what he needed to survive, sold the rest to distant trading posts, and moved on before anyone could ask his name or wonder about the scars that crisscrossed his arms like a map of old battles. He stopped, realizing he hadn't spoken his name aloud in months. "Lost," Rhiannon finished for him, rising to her feet. "That's what you are, isn't it?" I recognized the look. "I wore it myself for 2 years after my husband died in the valley fever." She stepped closer, and Kellen caught the scent of mountain herbs and wood smoke in her hair. "The elk gave you her life, Hunter. The least you can do is share her meat with someone who loved her." Before he could respond, she was walking away, her voice drifting back to him on the wind. "My cabin is the one with the red door. Follow the stream that runs silver in the moonlight." Kellen stood frozen, watching her figure disappear into the tall grass. His hands shook as he began field dressing the elk, and for the first time in 15 years of solitary hunting, he wondered what it would feel like to share a meal with another human being. As the sun reached its peak, he loaded the elk onto his horse and found himself following the stream she'd mentioned, drawn by something stronger than hunger, more dangerous than loneliness, the terrible, wonderful possibility that perhaps his long exile from human warmth might finally be coming to an end. The cabin sat in a grove of silver birches like a secret whispered by the forest itself. Smoke curled from its chimney, and the red door stood slightly ajar as if Rhiannon had been expecting him. Kellen dismounted, his heart hammering against his ribs with an unfamiliar rhythm. "I wondered if you'd come," she called from inside, "or if you'd lose your nerve and disappear back into the wilderness like a ghost." He pushed the door open to find her stirring something fragrant in a cast-iron pot, her sleeves rolled up to reveal arms strengthened by years of solitary survival. The cabin was small but warm, filled with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and books stacked on every surface. "I brought the meat," he said, feeling foolish with the obviousness of it, "and I've prepared everything else." She turned to face him, and he saw something in her expression that made his breath catch, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "But first, tell me your real name. Not the lie you were about to give me out there." Kellen set down the wrapped elk meat, his jaw tightening. "What makes you think I was going to lie?" "Because liars recognize each other." Rhiannon ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls. "I told you my husband died of valley fever. That was true. What I didn't tell you was that I killed him." The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Kellen's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, but Rhiannon didn't flinch. "He beat me," she continued, setting the bowls on the table. For 3 years, until the night he came home drunk and decided to use his fists on something that couldn't fight back our unborn child. She rolled up her left sleeve further, revealing a scar that ran from wrist to elbow. I defended myself. The Valley Fever story was simpler for the neighbors to accept. Kellen stared at her, understanding flooding through him like cold water. This woman who had shown such tenderness to a dying elk had killed to protect herself. And her child. The contradiction should have frightened him. Instead, it drew him closer. "Kellen," he said quietly. "My name is Kellen Draven. I was a soldier once, before I learned that some wars never end. And now you're a hunter who runs from his own shadow. Now I'm a hunter who just met a woman brave enough to tell the truth about blood on her hands." Rhiannon smiled for the first time since he'd met her, and it transformed her entire face. "Sit with me, Kellen Draven. Let's eat together and pretend we're two people who deserve peace." They ate in companionable silence, the stew rich with elk meat and root vegetables from her garden. Outside, evening was falling, painting the windows gold. When Kellen reached for his pack, preparing to leave, Rhiannon caught his wrist. "Stay," she said simply. "I have a spare blanket, and storm clouds are gathering." Besides, her thumb traced over the scars on his forearm. "When was the last time you slept somewhere you felt safe?" Kellen looked into her eyes and saw his own. Loneliness reflected there, along with something else, hope, fragile and fierce as a candle flame in the wind. "I don't remember," he admitted. "And let's find out together what that feels like." Thunder crashed overhead as Kellen jolted awake, his hand already gripping the knife beneath his makeshift pillow. The storm had arrived with violent intensity, rattling the cabin windows and sending rain against the walls like thrown stones. "Easy," Rhiannon's voice came from across the room, soft in the darkness. "It's just weather, not war." But Kellen was already on his feet, pacing like a caged wolf. The nightmare clung to him, flashes of burning villages, screams lost in smoke, the weight of choices that had driven him into 15 years of exile. His chest heaved as he struggled to separate past from present. "I should go," he said, reaching for his pack. "I shouldn't have stayed. This was a mistake." "Why?" Rhiannon rose from her bed, moonlight through the window turning her white nightgown ethereal. "Because you're remembering what it feels like to be human again? Because for a few hours you forgot to punish yourself for whatever sins you think you've committed." Lightning illuminated her face, and Kellen saw not judgment but understanding. She moved closer, barefoot on the wooden floor. "Tell me what you dream about," she said. "Villages burning because of my choices. Children who died because I was too slow, too weak, too human," she finished. "You dream about being human in an inhuman situation." Another crash of thunder, and this time Kellen didn't flinch. Rhiannon's hand found his chest, palm flat against his racing heart. "I dream about the night I killed him," she whispered. "Not with regret, with fear that I enjoyed it too much. That when I felt his blood on my hands, part of me was glad." "Does that make me a monster, Kellen?" He covered her hand with his, feeling the calluses from years of chopping wood and tending gardens. "It makes you a survivor. Then what does that make you?" The question hung between them as rain drummed against the roof. Slowly, Kellen lifted his free hand to trace the curve of her cheek. "Lost," he said, "until today." Rhiannon stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. "I haven't touched another person with kindness in 4 years. Haven't wanted to. But when I saw you standing over that elk, something in your eyes called to something in mine. Rhiannon." She rose on her toes, her lips brushing his ear. "I don't want to be alone tonight. Not in this storm. Not with these memories. Do you?" Instead of answering, Kellen cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was desperate at first, hungry with years of isolation, but then it gentled into something reverent. She tasted like hope and wild honey, like everything he'd forgotten he was allowed to want. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she took his scarred hands in hers. "We're both damaged," she said. "Both dangerous, both carrying ghosts." "Yes," he agreed. "Then let's be damaged together. Let our ghosts keep each other company." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin with the red door, two souls found shelter in each other's arms, discovering that sometimes salvation comes not from forgetting the darkness, but from no longer having to face it alone. Kellen woke to the scent of pine coffee and the soft sound of Rhiannon humming while she worked at the stove. Sunlight streamed through windows washed clean by the night storm, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe this peace could last. Then he saw the three horses approaching through the valley. "Company," he said quietly, reaching for his rifle. Rhiannon followed his gaze and went perfectly still. "That's Marcus Thorne on the lead horse. He's the territorial marshal. The other two are his deputies." "They're not here for you, are they?" Kellen was already calculating distances, escape routes, the quickest way to disappear into the forest. "No." She turned to face him, and he saw resignation in her storm-gray eyes. "They're here for you." Knowledge hit him like a physical blow. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday, when you told me your real name." She moved to a trunk in the corner and withdrew a yellowed wanted poster. His own face stared back at him, younger, harder, with the same haunted eyes. Kellen Draven. Wanted for desertion and the massacre at Broken Creek. $500, dead or alive. He should have been furious at the betrayal, should have been preparing to run or fight. Instead, he felt something close to relief. The running was finally over. "Why didn't you turn me in yesterday?" Rhiannon folded the poster carefully. "Because the man on this paper isn't the man who shared my table last night. Because I know what it looks like when someone is haunted by doing the right thing in the wrong circumstances." A sharp rap on the door interrupted them. "Rhiannon Vale. This is Marshal Thorne. We need to speak with you." She walked to the door with her spine straight, opening it to reveal a weathered man with silver threading through his brown hair and two younger deputies flanking him. "Marshal," she said calmly, "what brings you to my valley?" "We're tracking a fugitive, dangerous man, goes by Kellen Draven. We have reason to believe he might have passed through here." Kellen stepped into view, his hands visible and empty. "No need to hunt, Marshal. I'm right here." The deputies' hands moved to their weapons, but Thorne held up a restraining hand. His eyes took in the domestic scene, the breakfast on the table. Kellen's obvious comfort in the space. "Well," Thorne said slowly, "this is unexpected. Most wanted men don't announce themselves quite so readily. Most wanted men don't have someone worth surrendering for." Rhiannon's sharp intake of breath was audible, but she didn't speak. Thorne studied them both. "Mrs. Vale, are you being held against your will?" "No, Marshal. Mr. Draven is my guest." "Your guest?" Thorne's tone suggested he understood the full implications of that statement. "And you're aware of his alleged crimes?" "I'm aware of what he's accused of. I'm also aware that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." One of the deputies shifted impatiently. "Marshal, we should just arrest him and be done with it." "Perhaps." Thorne's gaze remained fixed on Kellen. "But first, I'm curious to hear his version of Broken Creek. 15 years is a long time to run from something. Long enough for a man to decide he's tired of running." Kellen felt Rhiannon's eyes on him, felt the weight of her faith in whatever choice he would make. For 15 years, he'd carried the truth of Broken Creek alone. Perhaps it was time to share that burden. "Broken Creek," he said quietly. "Yes, Marshal. I think it's time I told someone what really happened there." Broken Creek was supposed to be a routine patrol, Kellen began, settling into the chair across from Marshal Thorne while the deputies flanked the door. Rhiannon moved to stand behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. 12 of us sent to investigate reports of raiders hitting supply wagons. What we found was a trap. Thorne leaned forward, his weathered face intent. The reports said you opened fire on a peaceful settlement. Killed 37 civilians, including women and children. The reports were written by Colonel Vasquez. Who wasn't there? Kellen's voice hardened. He was 60 miles away, safe in his command tent, while we walked into hell. The deputy to Thorne's left shifted impatiently. All deserters claim innocence. Quiet, Jenkins. Thorne's tone brooked. No argument. Continue, Draven. The settlement was already burning when we arrived. The raiders' Corvani mercenaries had herded the civilians into the town square. They were using them as human shields while they looted everything of value. Kellen's hands clenched. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Morrison, ordered us to engage anyway. Said acceptable losses were part of war. Rhiannon's hand tightened on his shoulder, and he drew strength from the contact. I refused the order. Told Morrison we needed to wait, find another approach. He drew his sidearm and told me I could follow orders or be shot for cowardice. Kellen met Thorne's eyes. So I shot him first. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Jenkins started forward, but Thorne waved him back. Then what happened? The other soldiers, they were scared kids, most of them. They looked to me for orders. I told them we were going to do this right, even if it meant risking our own lives. Kellen's voice grew rough. We spent 4 hours picking off the mercenaries one by one. Careful shots, planned movements. We saved 18 civilians, Marshal. 18 people who would have died if we'd followed Morrison's orders. But 37 still died, Thorne observed quietly. 37 died before we arrived. The Corvani had been torturing them for information about military supply routes. Rhiannon felt Kellen tremble slightly under her touch. When Colonel Vasquez arrived the next morning, he saw a burned settlement, dead civilians, and a lieutenant with a bullet in his back. Easier to blame the convenient scapegoat than admit his intelligence had been compromised. And the other? Soldiers? Your witnesses? Agreed to testify against me in exchange for pardons. Can't say I blame them. They were kids following orders, even if those orders came from me instead of Morrison. Thorne was quiet for a long moment, studying Kellen's face. You know what I think, Draven? That I'm a deserter and a killer. I think you're a man who chose conscience over convenience. I also think you've been punishing yourself for 15 years for a choice most people would call heroic. Jenkins stepped forward again. Marshal, with respect, he still killed a superior officer. He still deserted. He saved 18 lives and prevented a massacre. Thorne stood, his decision apparently made. Sometimes the law has to bend to accommodate justice. Rhiannon's breath caught. What are you saying, Marshal? I'm saying that Kellen Draven died 15 years ago at Broken Creek. Died trying to save innocent lives. He looked directly at Kellen. The man I'm looking at is someone else entirely. Someone who's paid his debt and then some. You're letting him go? Jenkins's voice was incredulous. I'm recognizing that some crimes are actually acts of valor, and some fugitives are heroes who've been running from the wrong thing. Thorne moved toward the door. Mrs. Vale, I suggest your guest consider putting down roots somewhere. The running life is no life at all for a good man. As the 3 lawmen mounted their horses and rode away, Kellen remained frozen in his chair, unable to believe what had just happened. Free, Rhiannon whispered, kneeling beside his chair. You're finally free. He turned to look at her, this woman who had stood by him through his confession, who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Free to choose what comes next, he said, cupping her face in his hands. 3 months later, Kellen stood in the doorway of what had once been Rhiannon's cabin alone, watching her tend the expanded garden they'd planted together. The structure had grown. He'd built on 2 additional rooms and a proper workshop where he crafted furniture to sell at the trading post. The red door remained, but now it opened onto a home shared rather than a refuge from solitude. The Morrison chair is nearly finished, he called to her, wiping sawdust from his hands. Widow Morrison should have it by week's end. Rhiannon looked up from the tomato plants she'd been staking, her face bright with the kind of contentment that came from work shared with someone beloved. She'll cry when she sees it. You've captured his likeness perfectly in the woodwork. It had become their unspoken mission, using Kellen's woodworking skills to create memorial pieces for families who'd lost loved ones. Word had spread through the valley about the mysterious craftsman who could carve portraits into headboards and mantels, who never asked for payment from those who couldn't afford it. Marshall Thorne sent another letter, Rhiannon said, walking toward him with dirt on her hands and love in her eyes. 3 more families requesting memorial pieces. And, she paused, suddenly shy. An official inquiry about whether you'd consider taking a deputy position. Kellen stilled. What did you tell him? That I'd discuss it with my husband. The word hung between them, warm and wonderful and completely unofficial. They'd been living as husband and wife in all but law, bound by something deeper than marriage certificates, the choice to build a life together from the wreckage of their separate pasts. Your husband, Kellen repeated, pulling her close despite her garden-dirty hands. I like the sound of that. Do you? Because I've been thinking about making it official. She nodded against his chest. I want your name, Kellen. I want to be Rhiannon Draven and know that whatever comes, we face it together. And I want to give it to you. He tilted her face up to his. But are you certain? Taking my name means taking my history, all of it. Your history made you the man I love. The man who chooses saving lives over following orders. The man who builds memorial chairs for widows and refuses payment from families with empty cupboards. She traced the faded scars on his forearm. Besides, I have my own history to reconcile. We're both learning that the past doesn't have to define the future. That evening, they sat together on the porch he'd built, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Rhiannon's head rested on his shoulder while he carved delicate flowers into a jewelry box, a surprise meant for her birthday. I've been having different dreams, she said quietly. Good dreams or bad dreams, strange dreams. Dreams where I'm not alone anymore. Dreams where there are small voices calling me Mama. She felt him go very still beneath her. What do you think that means? Kellen set down his carving and turned to fully face her. I think it means we're both ready to stop running from life and start building one instead. Even if building a life means taking risks? Bringing children into a world that isn't always kind? Especially then. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. Because children born to parents who've known darkness but chosen light. Those children grow up understanding that love is a choice you make every day. Is that a yes to the deputy position? To staying here permanently? It's a yes to everything. Rhiannon, to marriage, to making this valley our home, to whatever family we build together. He held her close as night settled around them. I'm done wandering the plains. You brought me home. Above them, the first stars of evening began their ancient dance, witness to 2 hearts that had found their way to each other through pain and loss and the dangerous courage to love again. 1 year later, Rhiannon Draven stood at the window of their bedroom, watching her husband teach a group of valley children how to track deer through the morning frost. His movements were patient, gentle, so different from the haunted hunter who'd appeared in her life 18 months ago that she sometimes wondered if she dreamed that first meeting by the dying elk. Mama, a small hand tugged at her nightgown, and she looked down to see 4-year-old Lyra Morrison, whom they'd taken in after her grandmother passed. The child's dark hair was tangled with sleep, her brown eyes bright with morning mischief. "Good morning, little star," Rhiannon said, lifting the girl into her arms. "Did you sleep well? I dreamed about Papa Kellen again. He was showing me how to carve birds that could really fly." Rhiannon smiled, settling into the rocking chair Kellen had built when they'd first decided to foster children from the valley. Lyra wasn't their only charged 7-year-old. Tobias lived with them too, a boy whose parents had died in a mine collapse. The local families had come to trust the Dravens with their most precious burdens, understanding somehow that two people who'd survived their own darkness could guide children through theirs. "Maybe today he'll start teaching you to carve birds that stay put," Rhiannon suggested. "Those are easier to begin with." "But I want mine to fly." "All in good time, sweetheart." The front door opened with the sound of boots and happy voices. Kellen entered with Tobias and 2 neighbor children, all of them flushed with cold and excitement. "We found deer tracks by the old oak," Tobias announced, bouncing on his toes. "And Papa Kellen says we can make plaster casts to study them. After breakfast and chores," Kellen corrected, but his tone was warm with affection. He'd taken to fatherhood with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything else. As if making up for lost time by pouring all his protective instincts into the children under their care. As the children chattered about their morning adventure, Rhiannon felt the familiar flutter in her belly, stronger now, more insistent. She'd been waiting for the right moment to share her news with Kellen, and watching him with the children, she knew that moment had arrived, after breakfast and after the visiting children had returned to their own homes. Rhiannon found Kellen in his workshop, carving what looked like a cradle. "That's beautiful work," she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Who's it for?" "Hoped it might be for us." He set down his tools and turned to face her, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "I've been thinking about what you said last month about wanting a baby that shares both our blood." "Have you now?" She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "And what conclusions did you reach?" "That I want everything with you. Foster children, adopted children, babies that grow from our love, all of it." He searched her face. "Is that too much to ask for? Too greedy after everything we've been given?" "It's not too much," she whispered, guiding his palm to rest against her still flat belly. "In fact, it's perfect timing." The understanding dawned in his eyes like sunrise, followed immediately by joy so pure it took her breath away. "You're certain?" 3 months certain. The baby should arrive in late autumn, when the leaves turn the color of hope. Kellen lifted her off her feet, spinning her around the workshop while she laughed. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you," he said, framing her face with hands that still bore the calluses of hard work but had learned gentleness through her touch. "I love you and our makeshift family and the life we're building together." "I love you too," she replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. "My wild hunter who let himself be tamed by kindness." "Not tamed," he corrected against her lips. "Saved. You saved me, Rhiannon. Gave me a home worth staying for." Outside the workshop, they could hear Lyra singing to her dolls while Tobias practiced the whistling signals Kellen had taught him. Soon there would be another voice added to the happy chaos of their home, a child who would never know a world where love was uncertain, where family was anything less than chosen and cherished. That evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the valley gold, Rhiannon leaned into her husband's warmth and felt the deep satisfaction of a story that had found its proper ending. The lone hunter had indeed wandered the plains until a widow's kindness brought him home. But more than that, he'd discovered that home wasn't a place at all, but the choice to stop running and start building something beautiful with someone brave enough to love him. In the distance, elk grazed peacefully in the meadow where they'd first met, and overhead, stars began their nightly vigil over a valley filled with the laughter of children and the quiet contentment of hearts that had finally found their rest.